Yes, I did ruin this $3 headboard, but it was all in the name of science and furniture painting. I put 13 brands of chalk paint in a side-by-side test. I bought a new can of each one and compared how well they painted on, how well they leveled, how well they sanded, if they withstood a scratch test, and how well they finished under a top coat. The results were surprising for me on a few of these, and I'm here to share all the details with you for your next furniture painting project. All right, let's go.
First, I started in the same way I do for all my furniture pieces, and I cleaned it. I used TSP Substitute, a damp rag to rinse it, and then a dry rag to completely dry it off. After this, I did no other prep. I really wanted to see how well the chalk paint adhered to the surface. Plus, no need for primer here since this finish is intact and the wood is not going to bleed through. It's not mahogany or cherry or knotty in any way, so I don't need a primer here either. I tested Waverly chalk paint, available at Walmart, Annie Sloan chalk paint, Magnolia Home, Melange, Retique It by Renaissance, Dixie Bell chalk paint, Up chalk paint, which is available at Michael's, Recolor, which is a recycled chalk paint, Jolie paint, Rustoleum chalk paint, which you can find everywhere, Krylon chalky finish paint, which is available at Lowe's, Folk Art Home Decor chalk paint, which is available at Joann and Michael's and other stores, and Behr chalk decorative paint, which is available at the Home Depot. After painting on the first coat and throughout every step of this process, I took notes on each of the chalk paints so I could remember what was happening when I used them. I'm going to share all those results with you now. When applying the paint, there were a few chalk paints that just performed better than the others. What I'm looking for when I apply paint is that it brushes on smoothly and the brush doesn't drag super easily through the paint. Often this creates brush strokes, but either way, it's just not easy to paint when the paint starts to dry or drag quickly. Now, one way to get around this is to spray it with water, and that is a trick you can use with chalk paint. But for this test, I looked at which paints painted the best straight out of the can. The best paints for application that painted on the easiest without any brush dragging were Waverly, Behr, Dixie Bell, Jolie, Melange, and Recolor. They were super easy to apply and quite beautiful to paint with. On the other hand, in regards to application, Rustoleum, Magnolia Home, Folk Art, and Annie Sloan were all much more difficult to apply, with the brush dragging quite quickly through the paint, which makes it just not as easy to use. You may have noticed that I have Country Chic paint in this lineup, but I did not compare it to all these chalk paints. Country Chic is a all-in-one chalk style paint, and it doesn't necessarily need a top coat, unlike all the rest of these chalk paints. So I would categorize it more as an all-in-one paint. I'm working on a video comparing all the different all-in-one paints, and Country Chic will be in that lineup. When I sand chalk paint, I want to see a super fine dust and I want it to sand easily. That's one of the benefits of chalk paint is it's easy to distress, so let's give it a go. Although all of the chalk paints were able to be sanded, a few were super easy to sand and came off easily with 320 grit sandpaper in a really fine dust. Those were Annie Sloan, Dixie Bell, Waverly, Recolor, and Jolie paint. On the other hand, a few were much more difficult, almost slick to the surface, making them difficult to sand. Rustoleum, Magnolia Home, and Retique It. Now, this information on sanding might only be important to you if you're looking to sand between coats or to distress your piece. After painting on my second coat and letting it dry, I got up close and personal with the texture of each of these paints. I was looking for ridges from brushstrokes as well as a matte chalk-like texture, and this would be the test where the paints performed the most differently across the board. Let me share with you what I found out. The paints that showed the least amount of brushstrokes, now they're still there because it is chalk paint, but they're very minimal, are Waverly, Melange, Magnolia, Behr, Jolie, Dixie Bell, and Krylon. The paints that had the most brush strokes, almost with the texture of ridges as I ran my hand across the paint, were Rustoleum, Annie Sloan, Retique It, and Folk Art chalk paint. There was also a difference in the level of sheen of these paints. Some of them finished to a very matte, chalky texture. Those were Recolor, Dixie Bell, Krylon, Waverly, Jolie, Annie Sloan, and Up. Some of them were a little bit slicker, and I guess the best way to describe this would be a little closer to an eggshell finish. These were Behr, Melange, Rustoleum, Magnolia Home, and Retique It. I don't think there's a wrong or right for this one. It just kind of comes down to preference. I personally found Retique and Rustoleum to be too slick, while I was fine with Melange and Behr because they still felt slightly matte. Next up. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. I won't do that anymore to you. The scratch test. I put myself through hell and used my fingernail to try to scratch off the paint. For all of these paints, I was unable to use my fingernail to even get a little bit to scratch off. I brought in reinforcement and used a fork to try to scratch off the paint, and in all of the cases, I was able to scratch off the paint with the fork, although some paints did hold on longer than others. Annie Sloan, Dixie Bell, Waverly, and Behr held on the most with the fork scratch test. But all in all, I would call this test a wash. All of the chalk paints did just as they should. They stuck to that headboard really well without any sanding beforehand. Because applying a top coat is essential when you're using chalk paint, I wanted to test out how they looked under both finishes that I usually use for chalk paint. For my water-based top coat, I use General Finishes High Performance Top Coat, which is my favorite for furniture. And for the wax, I used Annie Sloan Clear Furniture Wax. For every single one of these paints, the top coats both applied beautifully. There were absolutely no winners or losers in this test. All the chalk paints behaved just as they should. So now I think that leaves us with my favorite chalk paints after this side-by-side test. After looking at the texture and the coverage and how easy it was to apply, as well as the price, here are my favorite brands of chalk paint. I split up the winners into two groups, the best specialty chalk paints and the best budget-friendly chalk paints. For the best specialty chalk paints, and most of these come in at around $1.50 to $2 per ounce and need to be bought online or at specialty retailers, my favorites were Dixie Bell, Melange, and Jolie, all painted on beautifully. My favorite budget-friendly chalk paints were Waverly, Krylon, and Behr. All of these come in at less than $1 per ounce and performed beautifully in my test as well. So if one of those brands of chalk paint that I tested isn't on this final screen, it means that there were probably a couple factors that made it less than ideal, at least in my opinion, for painting on furniture.